Hello and welcome to another video in the Shadow Rock audio video training series. Please, if you haven't already, watch the very first video which talks about the power on sequence for all of the audio and video equipment. In this video we will be discussing audio mixing and the audio sound system and how to operate it if you are wonderfully called to do so. In an additional video, we'll be talking about how to calibrate and equalize, perform feedback cancellation of the audio system and setting gain control in another video, kind of an advanced video. In this video, we're just going to talk about the basics of audio mixing, how sound systems work in general, and how you operate the mixer. First off, I just wanted to say that I'm not a pro audio engineer. I'm more of a YouTube certified audio noob. I've just watched a lot of videos and have kind of taught myself. I have linked a lot of great videos in the description under this video. So please check out all of the linked manuals for the audio board. We'll really teach you in depth everything that we're going to be going over. I've included some other videos on basic mixing 101. Some other manuals to other soundboards that kind of discuss, some theories on audio engineering. One thing to note about audio mixing and engineering is it's very subjective to your own ears. What sounds good to you may not sound, as great to somebody else. So it's very subjective on, everybody hears differently, everybody ears, work a little bit. But there are some kind of guidelines or goals that I try and go by to try and get a good audio mix. To me, the most important one is something called a low noise floor. If you just turn on the audio system and you go up to a speaker and you just listen, you'll hear kind of a wispy noise coming out of it, just like a shh. The less of that noise floor that you hear, the cleaner the sound will be, and that's kind of the ultimate goal, is to have a mix that's clean, that you can be able to have a balance where you can hear all of the different singers, all the different instruments, all at the proper, balanced mix level that will create a good sound for everybody. The biggest complaint you'll probably get is if it's too loud. I personally have very sensitive hearing, so to me, when sound gets too loud in an auditorium, especially in a church, it becomes uncomfortable, and that's something we want to avoid. I'd rather have something a little bit low than too high. That's just kind of my personal preference. When you are elected and have the ability to offer your services as a sound engineer here, all the decisions of the sound do come onto you. It's not that really of a big deal, but one thing is, everybody who's on the stage, they're worried about performing in front of everybody, and they want to sound good. Well, that's kind of your job as a sound engineer in the back here, which we technically call the front of house, is to empower everybody on the stage to perform without distraction, that they can perform at their best abilities and worship God to create a wonderful experience for everybody, those performing on the stage and in the audience to worship God. That's what this is all about. We're all serving God, and our goal is to create a good worship experience for everybody. So mixing can be very, very simple. Let's take a look at the mixing board here. A lot of people, when they look at this thing, they're like, oh my word, look at all these knobs, all these little buttons. What in the world do all those things do? And we're going to go over all of that. This is kind of a beginner's course, mixing 101. If you've never ever stepped behind one of these things before, this is an analog mixer. Digitals are even more fun. Have no fret. We're going to go through it from the beginning to end. Sound is pretty simple. It's just waves in the air. Typically, from what we can hear, is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, or 20,000 hertz. Of course, the very low end is bass, the very top end is treble, and On the stage, we have either microphones that pick up those sound waves, or pickups in guitars or bass players that pick up the strings, and then electronic equipment that generate the sound themselves. All of those inputs are all connected to a box that's back behind the corner there, behind the wood. And we call that a snake. All the different microphones and guitars and keyboards all plug into a box, and then the cable goes through the ceiling and then comes down the wall here. Hopefully we'll be fixing that soon. And then plugs into the back of our mixer here. So all of these different inputs, these larger ones with the 3 little connectors in them, are called Xlr inputs. So the ones that look like this we call 1/4 inch. And you can see we have 12 of these Xlr inputs. On each one of these is either like a microphone, keyboard, bass player. These are all different channels, channel 1 through 16. And this brings all of the inputs from all of the stage equipment into our mixer. We'll be going over all these different cables here in a second. The input comes in, it's amplified through a preamplifier here. We control the sounds, ultimately lands to our faders, which controls the master level of each channel. Comes out our main output, comes into our DBX, which we'll be going over in detail in the advanced video. Runs back up to the ceiling and then into our speakers. We have a powered left and right speaker and then a sub amplifier down below. That's pretty much it. Comes in from the stage, goes into the snake goes into the mixing board. Each item goes into a specific channel that we can control with all these knobs. We then control the sound level of each of the items. It gets all mixed into our mains, then it goes to our DBX and then back out to the speakers. So simply just ignoring all these knobs, just controlling the main level of each channel to whatever sounds right, controlling the master output here. That's as simple as mixing needs to be. Trying to get a good balance of every instrument and controlling the main volume level. And if you're called to serve one day and you are just thrown into this, pretty much that's all you need to worry about. However, we will be going over in detail all these knobs, what they all do, and kind of the theory behind how to obtain a good audio mix. Okay, we're back here at the back of the board, and I just kind of wanted to go over the connections here on the back of this Yamaha analog mixer. We have an input for each channel. We have the Xlr input, we have the 1/4 inch input, and then we have this port up here that's called an insert. What an insert allows you to do is using a 1/4 inch connection called a TRS connection, allows you to insert a external device in between the inputs and into the board. And what that's used for is either a compressor, which we actually happen to have one right here. Compressor, what it does, without getting too advanced, is it controls the loudness level, and if it gets too loud, it'll squash it down and control the maximum level of audio. So if you're singing and then all of a sudden you start screaming, it won't like blare everybody and keep that down. That's controlled by the insert port. Sometimes you can put in equalizers and things like that. As you can see, we're not using any inserts at this point. We may actually be hooking up that compressor on our main channel 1, so we have a dedicated compressor for the main singer. So if they happen to get loud or whatnot, that'll kind of keep that in control. These four here are our wireless mics, which are these guys. We have two handhelds, which are the two bottom ones, and then we have two earworm mics that go over the person's ear that they tuck into. These two, of course, are XLR. These are 1/4 inch, and those go into these particular channels. So if we look under our labels here, you can see what each particular channel is used for, and these are magnetic. These can be moved around. So we have the lead singer's vocals and guitar. We have additional singers, keyboard, singer, electric guitar, another keys, bass, a microphone that's connected to just a beatbox, or wireless microphone 2 and 3, then the pastor's earworms, mics 1 and 2. So all of the inputs come in through each channel, which then allows us to individually mix those signals, higher or lower, and using the EQ change their sound a little bit. We have the computer coming on ports 23 and 24, left and right, which we can have it labeled as the Mac right here on 2324. And then we have these guys. These are for the monitor speakers that are on the stage. There are 4 of them, and they're labeled A, B, C, and D. And what that allows us to do is send individual mixes or signals back to the stage so that the performers can hear what they're playing. You'll notice that the speakers are a little bit out in front of the stage. So everybody on the stage really can't hear what's behind the speaker. So that's why they use the floor monitors or floor wedges to get a mix that they are comfortable with in terms of hearing themselves so that they can play and hear what's going on. To the left of that, we have our main stereo out. This then connects to the DBX unit, the input of the DBX unit, and then out of the DBX unit, which the DBX unit is an integrated equalizer, balancer, feedback cancellation, limiter, has quite a few of the main things that you need for a system processing unit to control your main speakers. Again, that's all will be covered in the secondary advanced video. And then here we have a output to the computer. And from here, there's these cables go back behind the computer, and they're kind of split. One goes to the computer, then the other one goes up to the camera, which then feeds our live feed system. So that's pretty much all of the inputs and outputs for this particular Yamaha analog board. Okay, we're back here at the board, and what I'd like to do now is we're just going to go through kind of each layer by layer to discuss all of the different functionality and features of this board per the different channels and what exactly every one of these buttons do. You know, as I mentioned, really the only thing you really need to maintain or adjust while you're mixing is the main faders. These, you know, attenuate everything that's going on up here into a particular destination. So signal comes in, signal gets, you know, amplified by the preamplifier, goes through any sort of EQ, can get sent out to one of the 4 floor speakers, one of the monitors, and this controls, you know, how much of that signal gets sent out. Any effects that get applied to that individual channel. So if you have a singer and you wanted to give them some effects, that's what these white knobs do. The panning pot here will send the signal either to the left speaker or the right speaker if you wanted to get stereo separation. And then once that's all processed, then comes into the main bus here, and all you really have to do is adjust the level of that particular channel. If you wanted to make the singer higher or lower, if you wanted to raise or lower the guitar these faders are really the only thing you need to adjust. But since we're going to get a little bit more technical here, let's just go down every single option here, and we'll explain in a little detail exactly what they do. This very top button here is for phantom power, and it's split into these two different banks, 1 through 8, 9 through 16. And what that does is if there's a microphone, such as a condenser microphone or some sort of mic that requires power to operate, you can actually send power through the cable here to the device to power it on. But we're not using that right now, so we never want to turn that on. We want to leave those off. The next button here is what's called a pad button. So what this does, it when you engage it and you push it in, tell there, when you push it in, it cuts the signal down by 26 decibels, effectively chopping the signal down quite a bit. So whenever you'd want to use that button is for this particular adjustment here, which is your preamplifier gain. Gain structure, or the amount of gain or amplification per individual channel, is probably the biggest thing that will affect the sound source. When a sound is produced and it's captured by an electronic device, microphone, pickup, or generated by electronic device, that signal is then sent down the snake at a certain level. If the level is too low, you need to boost that signal up to get it to a usable level where it can then be processed and then put into the mix buses and sent out a usable level. If the signals coming in is too high and you have your gain all the way low and you hear something or it's just too high, you can hit this pad button, which will chop it down 26 decibels, and then you can raise the gain back up to an appropriate level. So probably the most difficult thing is the most important thing, and that is gain structure, your preamplifier here. On this particular board, down here by the faders, is a signal light and a peak light. And how I set gain structure or the sound level of a particular device is what I like to do is, and this is going to make someone very mad, but I'm going to set all the gains all the way off. Turn them all down. Okay. Turn them all off. Turn them all down here. And then, so right now, technically, if depending on the pad of the device, as you can see, most of the pads on all the microphones and devices are off. Usually the only device that we actually have to pad is the bass. So this is it's at 11, right? So 11 is our bass, right? So that's usually because they're going through another device on the stage that amplifies the signal. You have to cut down, but for the most part, the pads are not on for most of these channels. In order to set proper gain structure, what I do is, you'll notice on the faders down here, they have these numbers, and you'll notice that it goes 10, 5, 0, and the distance between 5 and 0 is pretty far. And then you start getting down to 10, 15. You can see that they're getting much, much smaller in terms of how close they are. The way that I've learned through, of course, YouTube schooling is you want to set all of these to 0. 0 is what's called unity gain. And unity gain means that this particular fader is not boosting. It's not boosting or attenuating, cutting down any of the original signal. The signal is coming in at its proper level on the gain, and it's not having to boost or cut it or attenuate it down here on the faders. That, in my opinion, creates the cleanest signal from the original source. It's not having to manipulate it, which does affect the sound quality. If you're adding voltage essentially to boost it, or you're cutting down voltage, you're affecting the original signal source, and that affects the sound quality of what's coming through the mixer. So whenever what I call resetting the board, usually when I reset the board and we go through the DBX process to recalibrate the room, what we'll do is we'll set all these gains to 0. And of course you don't want to do this Sunday morning, preferably. Set all the gains to 0. We set all the EQs straight up flat. Right. We set all of the faders to 0 at unity, or for whatever ones we're using. So we're not using these, right? So whatever we're using, we set to 0. To unity gain here. We come over here, and we'll talk about these subgroups in just a bit, but you'll notice that these are also faders, so we'll set these to 0, unity gain. And most scary, we'll set our main volume to 0. Okay, so right now, the buses, the master bus, the subgroup buses, they're all set to 0. They're not adding to or taking away any of the signal. So whenever we go through a sound check and we start bringing up each instrument, we then start having them either talk into the microphone, play their instrument, and then we slowly bring up the gain to a point that it sounds at the right volume level. Maybe slightly, just a little bit loud, but whatever's comfortable for you in the back of the room. Got to remember that as the speakers are hung high now, they have pretty good projection, so the sound level doesn't change dramatically when you're in the front or the back. But if you're closer to that speaker, it's going to be louder. So back here in the back, you don't want it to be too loud, because if you're in the front row, it's going to be way too loud. And again, I always try and get audio so that it's comfortable for me. Not too loud, not too quiet, comfortable. Back in the back, it's going to be a little bit louder in front, but you never want to be too loud. So that's the art of setting the gain structure, is getting the gain to a point where you're getting a good clean signal in. Because if the signal's too low, then you have to boost the fader up, which is going to bring up your noise, your floor, right? If the gain is too high and your faders are all the way down here at the bottom, then you have less control of the audio. What happens is when you are at 0, when you move the fader from 0 to 5, you can see that just from 0 to 5 decibels here, there's a lot of, you're moving the fader quite a bit. You have a lot more control than if you're way down here and you're moving 10 decibel, 30 to 40. That's a big jump. You don't have much control down here. And when you have too high of a gain and your faders are having to cut down quite a bit, you're going to lose sound quality and you're going to increase the potential for feedback. Feedback is really bad. We don't want that. So my particular way that I've just kind of picked up, initially setting the gain structure is based on this unity gain. And you'll notice on these knobs they have this little white patch here. That actually is unity gain for the preamplifiers here. So if you can get it in that area or close to it, then you're going to have a pretty good signal. It's not having to boost or add voltage to that particular channel to boost the signal up. It's getting a good signal from whatever's producing it, microphone, pickup on a guitar, and it's coming in, and it's getting a good, clean signal source into that channel for you then to do whatever else you need to do. So you may watch a lot of videos on the internet about gain structure, how to set your input levels, how to set gain structure. Every facility is different depending on if you have powered speakers or if you have amplifiers, if you have system processing for the house through DBX unit, or you're using specific compressors and equalizers and different equipment for system signal processing. The system's going to behave differently. If you're using different mixers, of course different. Whether it's a digital, analog, it's all different. So again, setting the gain structure is pretty important. What you'll see on the internet, however, is quite a few different methods for doing that. And this is just my particular method. It's what I find works pretty well. what you'll see is gain structures set for rock concerts or loud music halls, right? Well, they want to obtain the loudest volume they can by maxing out their signal flow to achieve the loudest potential output of the mixer before they start peaking, where when you start peaking you start getting distortion. Their goal is to get it up to that level, right up to that edge where it's, not peaking and getting as loud volume as you can get, and that's how they set their gain structure. Well, we're at a church. we don't need that sort of gain structure. What we want is the clearest sound, the most intelligible sound where we can hear everything the best. It's the lowest noise floor. We're not amplifying all the noise. So that's kind of how I prefer to set gain structure. And in those videos, they'll show you these different peak lights and signal lights. And a lot of people will say, well, you should turn up your gain knob here until you are seeing your signal light flashing green. That means you have a good clean signal. Well, if we're all at unity gain and we turn up our gain, we're getting a good signal. We can hear it clearly, and our green light's not flashing. No big deal. Again, unless you're at a rock concert, you're never going to see any of these red lights peaking. Otherwise, you'll be blown out the windows here. So one of the other things is the meters here, or the signal meters, I guess you'd call them. A lot of the videos on the internet will show you, hey, you got to get up to, 0 dB, or a good signal source is 3 or -3, -6 decibel. What I found is kind of not, I wouldn't say it's contrary to that, it's just my particular preferred method is, as I just showed you, set all the faders to 0, set your subgroups to 0, and your main to 0. The DBX has already calibrated the room to the loudness level that we want it. The attenuators on the amplifiers on the speakers have already been set to the loudness level that we want. We're just bringing the board up, gain structure wise, to the loudness that we want. And if you don't have to preamp or boost your signal much, hey, you got a cleaner signal from the source. You're not shooting voltage into it, affecting that signal. Okay, so hopefully that beats that horse. So the next thing down is what we call a low cut or a high pass filter. Very, very important to get a clean sound, and you'll notice that for the most part we have that pushed in or turned on for all of the different devices, except of course for our bass box, things that produce low frequency sound. What that does is it cuts from 80 decibels, well, not 80 decibels, 80 hertz and below. It just chops that sub frequencies completely out of the signal. Right now, we have our two main powered speakers, and they have a main speaker and a little tweeter up on top. The signal that's getting sent to that is the high signal from the DPX. We have our bass, which is sent from the low signal from the DBX, and the less amount of low frequencies that we can send to this system, if we had 20 speakers doing highs, mids, and lows, and they are able to produce, the movement of air to produce those frequencies in a clean manner, then we could get as much in there as we needed to. But since we're somewhat limited by the amount of speakers that we have, the more that we can cut out of that signal, the cleaner our overall mix is going to be. The less frequencies those speakers have to produce, the better. So, of course, we have microphones on the stage, and they're going to be picking up the bass, right? Bass is right there. They'll be picking up those frequencies and then putting them into the mixer. And, well, a singer's not going to go down to 40 hertz, 60 hertz. So if we can cut those signals out, that's less that the speakers have to produce, that's less those frequencies we can just get out of the picture, the cleaner our mix is going to sound. So we like to keep these on for all of our microphones, keyboards, guitars even, even though a keyboard can produce those low bass, if we have a bass player, that's what we'd like to preserve for him, is that space in the mix for his device to produce the sounds in that frequency range and not have to compete with anybody else. Of course, if we had a digital mixer, we'd have a lot more control over all of those different frequencies, and that leads into our equalizer section. On this particular board, we are somewhat limited to 4 frequencies that we can adjust per individual channel. And for the most part, you'll notice we don't do a lot of EQ changes. I always prefer to make as minimal amount of EQ change as possible, just because this happens to be an analog board and we don't have great control over the frequencies that it adjusts. The low does what we call a low shelf, so from, I think it's 100 hertz to 20. When you turn this knob, it's as a shelf, it's going to boost all of those frequencies up. These mid-range are peak, so they only do like 800 and 1200 frequencies as a peak, right? And then any frequencies to the left or to the right, as you bring that peak up, then those frequencies start getting boosted up too. So not very good granular control. And then on the high, that's also a shelf. So everything, from I don't know, 12,000 to 20,000 on the right-hand side of your treble, when you turn that knob, that hole gets shoved up. So for the most part, we don't do a lot of mid-range adjustments, and I always say leave EQ for last. If we ever do a board reset, you'll come in and you'll see all of the EQ flat. They'll be all straight up like this. One of the reasons for that is when we do the system tuning for the room, we ring out all of the microphones to produce feedback. So we set all of these to flat. We ring out the room with the DBX, get rid of all the feedback. It finds the feedback and then cuts out those frequencies that are causing the feedback. So whenever we do a full board reset, we set all the gain off, we set all the faders to 0, and all of the EQ will be flat. So the way that I normally come in on a Sunday is, if that's been done, the first thing to do, of course, is set your input, set your gain, set everything to 0, set the subgroups to 0, the mains. Per each sound check, per each instrument, raise the gain till you have a good signal, and then you leave that on. And then you go down through all the different instruments and singers, and then you get your gain structure. Once we then set the gain structure, normally we want to set the faders for the main house mix. Since this is a small venue, the sound that the main speakers produce can be heard on the stage. To get the cleanest sound in this room, the less amount of stage sound we have, I won't call it noise, stage sound, the better that we have control back here on the mixing board to control the overall sound of the room. If we have all of the monitors on the stage very loud, we've set the monitors first and then we set the house, we're competing with the stage sound and we cannot achieve a very good mix in the room. So I always like to start setting the sound levels with all of the monitors turned off. So we'll cover EQ at the very end, because that's, if you have time after everything is set, sound levels, monitor levels, if you have time then, if the mix is good, then you can control the EQ slightly, just a little bit here and there, to fine-tune the sound. The main thing is getting the mix right, getting the sound levels. Once that's done, then you can do EQ last, if you have time. It doesn't sound that horrible to have a flat mix, honestly. Yes, it's better to fine-tune things, to roll off the bass for certain speakers or singers so that they sound better, to boost up, the treble, sometimes on the keyboard. You can make fine-tune adjustments, but honestly, if you had to run everything flat on the EQ, really it doesn't sound too bad, especially on this analog board. Okay, so the next set is our 4 outputs to the stage. We have monitor A, which is the floor wedge on the front left, monitor B, which is the right, we have C, which is the keyboards, and D, which is back by the drums. So per channel we can send signal. So let's say that the main singer is on channel 1, right? And we want to put some of the singer into that front left monitor so they can hear themselves sing. Well, all we do is we raise this pot to give that, put more signal of channel 1 into that particular monitor speaker. And we can have 4 of those. So per channel, you can put the singer in the left speaker, right speaker, keyboards, and the drums. Of course, the lead singer needs to be in all of the speakers so that everyone can hear, you know, he's leading the tempo and the singing. Fairly important to have him in each of the monitors. You can do that per channel, per speaker. So let's say we're on, let's go down here, and we're on the bass, right? So the drummer says, hey, I need some more bass so I can drum with the bass. Well, you just turn up number 4 on that channel for the bass, and that will send more bass into that particular monitor. When we do a board reset, which I'm doing now because we're doing this training video, we set all the monitors off. Set all these guys down. Oh no! But that's okay, because this way, when we go to set the main mix of the house, we have no noise coming from the stage that we're having to compete with. So what we do is, you know, step 1 was to set everything to unity 0, unity gain 0. Step 2 is then raise the gain to a comfortable level. Then step 3 is to, let me back up. As you raise and add each instrument, normally they'll say, okay, you know, lead singer test, 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 right? You set your gain on that. Okay, player guitar, then you set the gain on the guitar, right? And you go through, and as you increase the gain on all these channels, your volume, your total volume level is going to come up. You have more signal coming in from multiple channels, all getting added and mixed together. Your overall volume is going to be increased, right? So you want to set each channel gain first so that every single person or instrument is at a good input signal. Then once you're done, what I usually find is, well, let me go back. So we've set the gain, we've set the faders to 0. They're still all at fader, all at 0, unity gain. All of our subgroups are at 0 and our main's at 0, right? So once that's done, usually the next step that I do is set the overall volume of the main house system. Usually all that requires is lowering the band subgroup. So the way that these faders work is you can control where the output goes per channel. So that's what these particular buttons are here. 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and then stereo. These essentially are 3 buses that this channel, after everything that's done to it, goes into either 1 and 2 bus, 3 and 4 bus, and stereo. And the reason why there's 1 and 2 on one button is essentially 1 and 2, 1 is left. So if we were to go left, that would be on 1, and we were to go right on the pan pot here, that would be 2, right? Or if we happen to be on 3 and 4, if we were to go left, that would be 3, and then right, that would be 4. We'll discuss stereo mixing here in a second. You'll notice we're not doing it. I'll explain that in a few seconds here. So the way we have it is all of the vocals are all set to go on 1 and 2, right? So if we look at anybody who's a vocal, 1 and 2 is pressed down. Stereo's not pressed. So all the vocals we're sending into bus 1 and 2. All of the instruments we're sending into 3 and 4. Okay. What that allows us to do is to group all of the vocals on these faders to raise and lower all of the vocals at one time, and all of the band instruments, all the music, raise and lower all at one time. Once gain is set, everybody tested all their instruments, they want to get right into practicing, usually. So at that point, we once the faders are set, the next thing that they will ask for is they'll start practicing and start playing a song. At that point, they will want more or less of something in their monitors. And since we've turned them all off, you can kind of guess that everybody's going to want the lead singer. But then you just ask each individual person, okay, main singer, what would you like in your monitor, that front left? Okay, I want some of this, want some of that, and then you just give them the monitor mix that they are requesting, just up to the point that they need. Again, our hope, our goal is to try and keep the stage level down to a minimum, only raising the monitors just what they need. Is our hope to create a good, clean house mix, trying to keep that stage volume level down as much as possible. But they need to hear what they need to hear. So it is important to give them, what they need on their particular monitor mixes. And that's usually the next thing. So we set the gain, we set faders, everything is at 0 right now. We give them the monitor mixes that they need in order to hear themselves, and then they'll start performing. And then at that point, we then start mixing the different levels of the house. And usually my particular preference is to have vocals slightly above or above the music. It's most important to hear the words of a worship song than the music, right? If you go into a mall, if you just listen to the music that's playing, you'll always be able to hear what the lead vocal is singing. You may not be able to hear the music so well, but what's most important is the vocal. So usually I will set the subgroup of the music down a little bit, to lowering that down to typically 5, and then we'll keep the vocals at 0. Right, that's usually the starting point of the subgroups that I like to keep it at. And then usually the main volume, after we've added all the instruments, is probably a little too loud. So then we'll lower, the main volume to between 5 and 10 typically. That's usually my starting spot when I come in after a board reset's been done, to kind of start mixing the levels. And then at this point, we will then raise and lower the faders to create the mix that we are looking for. Typically you want to keep the vocals around unity gain. That again is the cleanest and clearest signal. But you don't want the guitar blasting over the vocals, right? So then we'll lower the guitars down. We'll keep the singers. Maybe the background singers you can lower a little bit. Keys, depending on their gain, how we gained it, you can keep that at 0, or you may need to adjust the keyboards. This is the art of mixing, of balancing each individual channel or input to create a mix where the goal is to be able to hear each individual singer primarily, then secondarily hear each individual instrument. Now, if you have a lot of instruments, some people like to give priority to certain instruments, lead singer, lead guitar, and then background singers, and then backup guitar, mixing the bass and the keyboards. Thankfully we don't have too many instruments we have to mix together, and it just comes with practice of finding that balance of the mix through the faders, giving it, usually we don't really boost past the unity gain. Usually we keep it at 0. On some particular instruments, bass, sometimes depending on the gain structure, we have to boost it a little bit. But for the most part, most of the time, if you just come in and you see all the faders, most of the singers are at around 0, plus or minus 5, and then the keys are usually around 5. Electric guitar, depending on how that's been set, you never want to come in and just leave everything at 0. You always want to mix the instruments and the vocals that sound good. That's the art of mixing, finding that balanced mix that something's not too loud, something's not too quiet. You can hear the vocals, you can hear what's being sung, but you can also then hear the keyboards, you can hear the electric guitar, rhythm guitars. That's the art of mixing. Once you get that down and you have your general mix set, most of the time you don't have to adjust your faders at this point. When service starts and they start playing, if they start playing harder, you can raise and lower just the music, you can raise and lower just the volume of the singers, the vocals, and of course the main output of the house, you can control that loudness level. So most of the time when you're mixing, you may be making very slight fine-tune adjustments over here on these faders for these different channels. Maybe the bass is a little too much. Once they all start getting going, lower that a little bit. But most of the time you're working over here on your subgroups. Okay, I need a little bit more music. It's a faster song, or it's a slower song, a little bit more vocals. Oh, it's a little too loud. Trying to find that good level of volume through your subgroups and then your main. So back to our buttons here. As I said, the vocals are 1 and 2, the music is 3 and 4, but on some things we're on stereo. So we're going directly into the stereo bus. We're not going through these subgroup buses. We're going right to stereo. And usually we have all of our wireless mics. So the 2 wireless mics, the pastor's mics, and the computer are going directly into the stereo bus. So these wouldn't affect anything going directly into stereo, just our main stereo bus here. Alright, so let's go back up to some of these buttons here. You notice just below these first bank of monitor sends into these auxiliary buses, we have this little PRE button. That stands for pre-fader. What that means is when this button is pushed in, these faders down here, when we're lowering them and raising them to create a good house mix, that's not affecting the levels that's going out to the stage monitors, right? Once we set the gain, and then we go through and we set the monitor mixes for each of the different people on the stage for their monitor mix, when we're making fine-tune adjustments or big adjustments down here, we don't want that to change what's going on in the monitors. So it's raising and lowering the volume coming out of the monitors for the people on the stage. That's what's called pre-fader. These auxiliary sends are sent out before the faders, and these making adjustments down here don't have any effect on what's actually coming out up here. Now for some reason, or for some reasons, you can turn that off if you have different equipment connected to the auxiliary bus. Right now we have our 4 monitors, but you could hook up other equipment. You can hook up compressors, equalizers, all kinds of other things, and you may want that to ride or adjust with your fader. But for us, for both A and B and C and D, there's 2. For these 2 banks, we are pre-fader. Alright, so we're not usually utilizing effects too heavily. If we come over here and we look at this other section here, so I guess at this point, I'll cover all this other stuff here on the right at the very end. We'll just go to our particular effects, and right now on this board there's 2 effects buses, effects 1 and effects 2, and you can control what those effects are by changing these knobs. So right now we are on reverb vocal 1 for effects bus 1, and then delay on effects bus 2. To control effects, when you add effects, especially reverb to a vocal mic, it really gives them a much more nicer sounding, bigger voice. Makes the room feel bigger. It just adds a little bit more, nicer sound to that particular vocal. To add effects, there's a couple different ways that you do it, and on this board, let me just go through that for you. So you'll notice that per channel we have a white knob for effects, And what this controls is how much of this particular channel is going into that effects bus. If you have the effects turned off and you raise and lower this, it's not going to do anything. This just controls how much of that signal from this particular channel is going into the effects bus. Okay, and we have effects bus 1 and effects bus 2. And whenever we do a board reset, we typically don't reset these effects. Normally these are set, and I'll show you how to turn on and off the effects globally here in a second. So per channel, we control how much of the signal of that channel goes into the effects bus. And then over here, these control how much the effects actually activates, right? So this is like a global parameter per the effect, and each effect, this knob can do something different. It's a parameter, not a volume knob. So the signal comes in from the channel into the effects bus, and then this controls how much of the effects gets applied to that signal, essentially. Okay. Once the effects gets applied, it then has to come back into one of the output buses, and you could actually send effects into the 4 auxiliary buses for the monitors, and right now we have that off. You can have different effects sends. There's some ports on the back here where you can just send out effects to a processor and have it come back in again. We're not doing that. Overall, to control the overall level of effects coming back from the processor is this knob right here. So to turn on the effects, you just press this particular on button here for effects channel 1, and then when that is on, the amount of overall effects from the effects bus, so signal comes into the channel, the level of signal of that channel gets sent into the effects bus, it does whatever it's set to do, and then that grouped signal then comes back in to the effects return. And as you can see, we have our buttons here to control where those effects get routed in. So think of effects as a separate, kind of like hot chocolate on ice cream. You know, your ice cream is over here, but you can add and pour on as much of effects on top of that as you'd like. And it's currently going into the stereo bus. So whatever we send into the effects bus, whatever the effects are doing, we then just dump that back into the main stereo bus, and it's combined, and you really can't tell that it's different. It's just kind of like, I don't know, hot fudge syrup on top of ice cream. So that's what these white knobs do here. This little button here for aux 5 and 6 is, if you didn't want to use the effects processor built into the board, again, it's nice that it's there, but let's say you have a real fancy, you know, outboard effects processor that does all kinds of cool stuff. Well, you can actually route the signal out of auxiliary 5 and 6, which is right there. You'll notice we have auxiliary 5 and 6, and you actually can route the effects bus directly out. We could have it sent, if you push it in, you can send that out to somewhere else instead of using the built-in effects. Well, we're not using that, so these are all popped out. The next thing here is panning. Panning controls whether it's sent to the left or the right. And as I mentioned, if you're going into a subgroup, it would go to 1 or 2, or if you're on 3 and 4, it'd go to 3 or 4. Okay. In a larger venue where you have, you know, more speakers, and if you listen to, there's a video that I've linked in here for stereo separation. It really sounds nice if you could do stereo separation where you send certain vocals to the left, certain vocals to the right, certain parts of a drum kit to the left, to the right. You know, this particular guitar to the left, keys to the right. If you can kind of separate the audio panning it from left to the right, it really sounds real nice. Your ears have spatial abilities, so they can pick up different sounds spatially. It really sounds nice. So if you put on a pair of headphones and someone has stereo separated their mix, it really sounds good. In our building here, it doesn't really do anything. We just don't have the speaker system, the distance necessary really to get an effective stereo separation for panning. And in a church, if you're way over here on the left and you pan, let's say, the guitar all the way to the right, well, that person's not going to be able to hear a guitar. We want everybody, no matter where they're at, to hear everything, right? So that's why we've elected to just keep everything panned straight up, both left and right, and just so everybody can hear everything. And if our room was different, if we had multiple speakers, maybe we could do some stereo panning. Really, that's more for recording. For a live, event, maybe a little bit of panning here and there, but for the most part, we're just panned straight up and down. However, you'll notice that on our subgroups here, we have this guy all the way to the left, this guy all the way to the right, this guy all the way to the left, and this guy all the way to the right. The reason why that's said is if for some reason someone wanted to do some sort of panning, in order to preserve the panning adjustments, when you're going into a subgroup, you have to pan these subgroups. This is a stereo. This is like the left, this is the right, this is the left, this is the right. All of these are getting sent to the stereo bus. You'll notice that there's a button here to send to the stereo bus. So our subgroups are getting sent from here, these adjustments, into our main stereo group. You could output these out the back for some reason to other speaker systems or amplifiers, whatever. But for us, we're going to the stereo bus. So this acts as number 1 left, number 2 right, number 3, number 4 left and right. So really, this isn't doing anything, but it has to be there in case someone actually wanted to start doing some sort of panning with these particular buttons. The next thing down is the on-off switch. So, of course, if this is not on, you're getting signal in. You may see signal flashing here, but it's not actually getting down into the actual fader section. It is going out to the monitors, but it's not coming out through the main mix. This just pretty much controls what's coming in through the main mix, right? So earlier on, as you're setting gain control, you turn on the first instrument, you set the gain, and then you leave it on. You then move to the next instrument, set the gain, leave it on, and then you move on. That will reduce feedback if there is any. I should say you'll catch feedback by leaving everything on. In the advanced video, we will talk about how we control feedback with this DBX. It works great, and we'll cover that. The next thing down is PFL, and this is just used for monitoring. It stands for pre-fader listen. So when you click on that, if you were to plug in some headphones right here, and you can control the audio for the headphones, you can listen to the individual channel through the headphones, and you can kind of hear better. Maybe at that point, after everything is mixed, all of the volume levels are set correctly. Monitor mixes are good for everybody on the stage. You then want to start fine-tuning with the equalizer. Well, you can then do a PFL, pre-fader listen, and no matter where the fader is set, you're hearing a signal through the headphones that allows you to kind of hear that particular channel. Oh, maybe there's a buzz coming from the bass, and so you hit PFL on the bass. Oh wow, that's where that buzz is coming from. Then it kind of helps you diagnose signal issues, and when you're fine tuning, EQ, if you really want to hear up close to the headphones, that's kind of what the PFL does here. Okay, well, let's move over to this side of the board here. You'll notice we have left, right, keys, and drums. These are the master volumes for our auxiliary buses that we're using for our 4 monitors. Essentially, all of these knobs, A, B, C, D, these control the individual inputs to those auxiliary buses per channel, but these are the master volumes for the monitor. So if you needed to raise or lower the entire volume of that monitor on that auxiliary bus, you would adjust these knobs. But for the most part, we don't adjust these. These are pretty much set. The volume knobs on the monitors are set. The only thing that we really adjust is how much of that channel gets sent into the monitor, because we've already adjusted those levels, which is usually straight up most of the time, and then on the monitors are usually straight up. Okay. We don't use any of these return buses because we're not sending out anything to some sort of external equalizer, effects processor, compressor. You can send all kinds of stuff, any mix you want, out of the board, have it processed, and then have it returned back into the board, and control the individual returns into the stereo bus, into the other auxiliary buses if you wanted to, if you had some sort of effects. We're not using that, so these returns are not being used whatsoever. As I mentioned, under the effects, you can send effects to the monitors, but for the most part we don't do that. We may do that on like possibly a vocal if someone wanted to hear how their voice sounds in the effects, but for the most part they can kind of hear it in the room, and we don't really send any effects into any of the 4 auxiliary buses, which is these guys right here. Tap is for a tap delay, which we will never use. To turn on and off the effects there's an on and off button here. So let's say that they're singing, they're having a song, and you want to turn on the effects. You hit the on button, right? And then you control how much of the effects gets added into the main stereo bus. Well, let's say that they start praying or they start talking, and you don't want those effects on while they're talking. All you got to do is hit the button. You could theoretically just lower the fader down, which is a little smoother than just chopping it off with the on-off button, but you have both abilities to do that. As I mentioned, we're not really using delay or any of the secondary effects. Maybe if we get a little more fancy, we would, but for the most part, we're not using the second effects bus. We're just using reverb on the main effects channel 1 here. This set of effects knob here is a little complicated to explain. Pretty much we just want to leave it on these arrows. This is a secondary effects return into the board. We are not sending out these effects and taking them back in again. So if on the back you'll notice that there's actually an effects, let me see if I can find it here. There's effects send right there, right? So if we were sending out our effects through those 2 outputs, we would control them here. We're not doing that, so we'll just leave that off. While we're here, you'll notice that there's some AFLs, but PFL, AFL. PFL stands for pre-fader listen, meaning you can adjust these faders and it won't affect what you're hearing in the headphones. After effects means it is after the fader, after fader listen. So if you're making adjustments to the faders, what you're hearing AFL or after the fader will change in your headphones. So when you do AFL on either the subgroups or the main, as you raise and lower these faders, no matter what your volume level is set to here, it will raise and lower. And that's how these subgroups and the main stereo bus are set for AFL. That pretty much covers the operation of this board here. Again, the art of mixing is finding the cleanest, clearest balance of your instruments and singers. Fine-tuning over here to get the right mix of each individual channel, and then controlling the overall volume as a subgroup, vocals and music, and then the overall volume in the house by the stereo fader here. Okay, well the last thing we're going to talk about is EQ. Don't touch it. No, I'm kidding. If you have time, after everything is balanced, volume levels are set, monitors are set, if you have time, and honestly, if you have a good ear, you know kind of what you're looking for, you can then start adjusting the EQ. Typically, what I find is for vocals, for most male vocals, I'll roll off some of the bass to free up the system from having to process those low frequencies that they're not really singing in, and that'll clean them up a little bit. I like to add a little bit, and again, these are shelves, so it's raising and lowering that whole lower frequency range. Additionally, the treble is also a high shelf, so that when you're raising the treble or those higher frequencies for a vocal, it does sound nicer. Typically, I won't adjust the mid-range frequencies unless for some reason there's feedback. Most feedback does occur in the middle frequency ranges. So if you're starting to get feedback or just a weird wonky sound per se, you can then typically lowering the mid-range will kind of reduce that feedback. These equalizers are taking away voltage or adding voltage for those particular frequency ranges. These will lower or raise your volume levels. That's why it's good to start out with a flat EQ mix after a board reset, so that everything is at the right volume level when you are setting your mix, setting your monitor mixes, and in the second video or the advanced video, when we're tuning the room, we want all this to be flat so that we can have no addition or subtraction of voltage to these frequency ranges that is affecting our overall signal, making it higher or lower in those particular frequency ranges. But as I said, for most vocals, typically we'll roll off a little bit of the bass, we'll roll in a little bit of the treble, and then depending, if it's sounding wonky or getting feedback, we'll typically lower the mid-range. Normally we don't usually raise. My particular preference is usually to lower anything on the EQ, to subtract or get rid of anything that sounds bad, or to reduce the amount of signal of those frequency ranges that the system has to produce. On an analog board, we really don't have that level of control as we would on a digital board or like a 36-band EQ to really fine-tune those frequencies and boost where we need to or cut where we need to. On this particular board, it's better to cut, subtract than it is to add, because certainly you're not increasing your overall volume level by raising EQs in those different ranges. Just sounds better if you subtract just the areas that you're bad. Typically, boosting the treble will sound fine, and that's pretty much just very fine-tuned adjustments on the EQ. You really don't need to adjust the EQ very much, and really only if you have time, and really only if something sounds bad. If it sounds fine with a flat EQ, maybe they have the keyboard mixed or tuned, guitars tuned. If it sounds fine flat, leave it flat. You'll get the cleanest sound that way, as opposed to boosting or cutting the signal, which is going to affect sound quality. But again, for most vocals, you will roll the bass off a little bit, increase the treble a little bit. For most guitars, if they're a little too bassy, we'll roll the bass off. Maybe increase, some of the higher mid-range for particular instruments. The bass itself, we typically will boost the bass because, hey, it's a bass, right? So we'll boost the bass on the bass. And you'll notice back up on our cuts, we're not cutting the bass. We want all those sub-frequencies to come through on that channel. But for the most part, we're cutting out all of the lower frequencies, almost everything else. And that pretty much is the EQ section. There are some of the documents. One of the documents from I think it's Soundscape that I've listed in the description of this video has very good kind of basic, what for a particular instrument, hey, boost here, cut here, but really you want your ears, honestly, to make the final adjustment. You don't want to go, okay, this is a bass guitar, boost the bass, blah blah blah, cut the treble, right? You really want to adjust EQ if you have to, based on how things sound. You'll hear, and then whenever you want to EQ something, you want to focus your ears on that particular instrument, paying attention to how that instrument's sounding, trying to pick that out of the mix, maybe boost it up a little bit so you can hear it a little bit better, and say, okay, something sounds weird, maybe in the mid frequency, let's cut that out, or hey, sounding a little weak, maybe we need to brighten it up by boosting the treble a little bit. Now, that's just something that comes with experience, and the rule of thumb is don't EQ if you don't have to. That's just my particular preference. And I think that pretty much covers mixing 101 here at Shadow Rock Church. I know this is kind of a long video, but hey, this is for the new guy. If you come in on a Sunday and say, hey, you doing anything? If you watch this video, you'll be able to sound like a pro.